Hello, and welcome to StubHub's presentation on eliminating fraud through analytics. We're thrilled to have StubHub as a sponsor this year, and they've prepared a great presentation for us. Tim Malone, the senior business analyst, is going to be giving a high-level overview of how they use data to improve the fan experience. And then Robert Capps, who is the senior manager of trust and safety, will be talking about how the analytical methods that they've used have allowed them to identify and mitigate fraud in ticketing. There'll be ample time for questions at the end of the presentation. And I'll hand it over to Tim.
Mic'd up. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Malone, Senior Business Analyst at StubHub. And before my colleague, Robert Capps, gets up and talks to you about how we're eliminating fraud on our site through analytics, I'm going to talk to you a little bit at a high level about how StubHub uses data to continuously improve the fan experience. And I guess it's a good chance here to thank Jeff and everyone at Sloan for putting this conference together and giving us a chance to learn more about the sports industry and how it continues to evolve. At StubHub, we're specifically focused on fans and how the experience for these two guys continues to evolve. And in a moment, I'm going to walk you through a few examples of how we use data to make their experience better and better. But before I do, I want you to imagine for a moment a world without fans. Imagine a world where stadiums across the country were empty every weekend in the fall. And adjacent parking lots were as well. And imagine a world where the clicker didn't work so well. That's the world we're living in right now. So let's bring it back to the world without fans. Imagine also a world where hockey arenas would just be a place for people to gather and stare at oval slabs of concrete. And imagine a world where people in the Midwest would wear goofy hats in the fall and the winter. Thankfully, this is not the world we're living in. It's a fan's world. And stadiums are packed in the fall, and people are tailgating outside of these stadiums. And hockey arenas are filled to the rafters. And people in the Midwest still get to wear goofy hats in the fall and the winter. So before I get into some examples of how we use our data to continuously improve the fan experience, I want to walk you through kind of the evolution of the fan. And we're going to start at pretty much the dawn of fan, the Roman Colosseum. And by the looks of this here CGI, that was a pretty tough ticket to get. And even if you did know a fan who knew a guy who could get you tickets, chances are pretty good that your knowledge of the quality of those seats wasn't so great before you got there. Like this guy. He thought he was in row 1, but he was actually in row I. So let's take a look at how StubHub used data to improve that experience. Fast forward to 2006, and StubHub was the first company to introduce interactive venue maps. What these maps do, for those who aren't familiar with them, is group tickets in uniform sections, which allows buyer to compare listings by zone and price, and it also allows sellers to better merchandise their tickets. But as I said, the fan experience continues to evolve, and here's how we use data to improve our venue map experience. What we did is we dug through our customer satisfaction data, and we found that the biggest root cause that drove seats not meeting expectations for fans was that when they were browsing and searching for tickets, they couldn't determine the row within the section. So let's look at how we use some data and aligned it with a project to make this experience better. What we're doing now is we're gradually rolling out row-level detail within sections. So fans can decide, do they want to sit in row AA or row A, row R or row 23, or maybe even row 1 instead of row I. So now the next step in our evolution of the fan is going to take us down Storrow Drive here to a building built in 1928, the old Boston Garden, home to many classic games and some pretty freaking legendary players, and some pretty bad friggin' seats. And even though modern arenas since 1928 have continued to make the experience better, I'm sure we've all had an experience where we've gotten to a game and we have a limited or partial view of what we're seeing. Thank you, Joe Ellen, for being our human poll. So now let's look back at that customer satisfaction data that we looked at StubHub. And we see that the second root cause that drives seats not meeting expectations for fans was simply that when they searched for tickets, they couldn't tell if they were obstructed view or not. So let's look at how we used some data and aligned it with a project to improve that experience. What we did with this data is set up our sell flow. So when sellers list tickets now, they're required to disclose certain ticket features, like if a seat is on the aisle, or if a seat is a limited or obstructed view. In turn, what this does is when buyers get to our event page and they search for tickets, they can restrict their search to only return seats on the aisle. One more, two more, bam. And they can exclude obstructed view as well. So again, another example of how we use data and aligned it with a project to improve the fan experience. Now, the final step in our journey through the evolution of the fan is going to talk a little bit about technology. And as everyone knows, technology has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. But people and fans actually have a lot more in common with this guy than you might think. We're very much on the go, and we want access to things immediately. For fans, you want tickets at your fingertips. So one of the innovations StubHub rolled out in 2011 was our StubHub mobile app, which allows fans to buy tickets through their mobile device. And while we're just beginning to get our heads around this data, what we're beginning to see is a shift to more and more mobile transactions as you get closer and closer in the days and hours leading to event time. So again, these are just some high-level examples of how we as a company use data to continuously improve the fan experience. And now I'm going to hand things off to my colleague, Robert Capps, who will talk to you about how we're preventing fraud through analytics.
Thank you, Tim. So, is this thing really broken? Okay, well, let's get rid of it then. So, I'm Robert Capps. I run the trust and safety team that's responsible for marketplace risk, consumer experience around getting good tickets and running the fraudsters off our marketplace. I guess I'm going to be the human clicker this time. Good. So not so long ago in a galaxy not so far away, ticket fraud was really easy to define, right? You physically had a ticket in front of you and you could identify whether or not there were items that were suspect around it. In this case, you know, the words, oh, I'm sorry, not quite yet. In this case, the words Toronto was a big tip there. So I hear some chuckles in the audience. Okay, next one. Then this thing called the internet came along. This guy invented it, little guy. Anyway, and that changed the face of commerce, especially for ticketing, because consumers suddenly became a lot more anonymous. When a consumer goes online, all you have is the information they put on the website. You don't have a human in front of you anymore to transact with, so you don't have the kind of identifiers that in-person commerce tended to provide. And those were great pieces of information to know when you were buying a ticket from somebody, because if you were on the street picking it up from them, you could make a judgment call as to whether or not they were trustworthy. Or on the retailer side, when someone's standing in front of you with a credit card, you could identify who they were, and you could tell the cops if they ripped you off. When you bring anonymous transactions to the internet, it brings a certain element to the party, which tends to cause problems in a marketplace where the fraudsters have decided that they want to target you. So how does StubHub fit in? So StubHub is, wait, before I go there, who's heard of StubHub? I like that answer. Who's used StubHub? Cool, I like it. Okay, so you're familiar with this product. I saw some hands that were down, so I won't go through all of them, and I won't go over that line because the camera guy can't get me. We bring buyers and sellers together into a neutral marketplace. And we do so by managing the entire life cycle of a transaction. From the point where a customer comes online to purchase the tickets, we take those funds to the point where we disperse the tickets out, or the money out to the seller of those tickets. Oh, I'm sorry, back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the things we also do is we use a lot of the data that's driven through the marketplace to track the life cycle of a transaction. So we look for exceptions, like tickets that haven't been shipped to a buyer yet, and we look for ways to manage the customer experience from managing those data points. We're also providing transactional assurance. Has anybody had to use the Fan Protect guarantee in here? I like the fact that there are very few hands that go up on that. The Fan Protect guarantee effectively sits in the middle of the transaction, and it basically tells a seller, if you fulfill your end of the bargain, if you sell these tickets and you deliver them, we will pay you. You don't have to worry about chargebacks, you don't have to worry about any of those things. For the buyer, it says, hey, don't worry about who's selling them, right? If you go to some places, you've got to identify who are you doing business with. If you go to like an eBay, you're looking at people's feedback, you're not looking at the tickets you want to sit in. We take that away. People pick the seats they want to sit in, and we guarantee that they're going to be good. Back, please. I talk with my hands. I'll go like this. Okay. So in our marketplace, fraud exposure typically takes, sorry, it's so weird having to look back at the slides. So fraud exposure is generally tied in our marketplace to stolen credit cards. Someone coming to our marketplace with a credit card that was breached through whatever reason. They're coming in, they're trying to buy tickets with a stolen credit card so that they can go and resell them on some other marketplace or because they want to attend an event. And unlike most marketplaces, we don't pass those losses on to the sellers. Okay, now you can go. So how does StubHub work? So this is probably remedial for some of you guys. If you have a ticket, you place it on our site for sale. If you want to buy a ticket, you come to our site, you find the tickets you want, you pay us. The seller will then ship those tickets to you. And once we've identified those tickets have been delivered, we pay the seller, and everyone's happy. Next. So that presents some very interesting risks within the marketplace, especially for StubHub. As we talked about a moment ago, the use of stolen credit cards in the marketplace to purchase event tickets is a real risk to us because, well, you lose a lot of money when that happens. That's one of the major buyer transaction risks. The second one is buyer's remorse. So we see a lot of people who buy tickets, ringside tickets to the boxing match, and then the wife sees a credit card bill and I didn't make that transaction, right? So that results in a chargeback. We also have another situation where we have unauthorized transactions in our marketplace where through various reasons an unauthorized family member gets a hold of the password to log into mom's account and buys tickets to whatever teeny show they want to see, or they end up grabbing mom's credit card and opening their own account. We also see sell-side transaction risk. Seller failing to deliver tickets, they sell something that isn't valid, or they deliver the wrong tickets. We're not going to really talk about that. It's a very small piece of our risk profile. And we go to the next slide. So business models where there are risk, you get good at managing the risk, and then sometimes the business models change. So that happened to us in 2010. Prior to 2010, a ticket being sent to a buyer from the seller typically was a piece of paper. It was a hard stock ticket of some sort. It was stuck in an envelope, a FedEx label was put on top of it, and it was put into FedEx. That provides a certain amount of transactional delay that allows you to look for suspect transactions, so things that were potentially a criminal trying to buy tickets with a stolen credit card. You can get your hands around those, you can get those packages rerouted, you can deny the fraudster the ability to actually monetize the attack. And then we deployed a new product. It was a product called Instant E-Delivery. That product allowed you to instantly download tickets as soon as you gave us your credit card, which is great. Customers loved it. Fraudsters loved it more, right? And so what we found was the timelines for detecting fraud went from a day, maybe two during the delivery window for FedEx, depends on how long it sat on a truck, to nothing. And we hadn't changed our processes to deal with that. And so what we ended up doing is we were forced to do, because NHL and NBA season happened about this time, and that's a massive, massive market opportunity for selling tickets. What we ended up doing was, oh, I'm a slide ahead. Anyway, so let's talk about what happened. So e-delivery, we launched that in March of 2010. In April of 2010, the fraudsters really loved it. And next slide. So we had this really interesting challenge. We needed to look at, or we needed to evaluate our order volumes. We needed to find a way to find these fraudulent transactions in the sea of really good ones. And we needed to do so as fast as possible because the risk of digital downloads was really great. So how do you do that, right? And this is a this is an analytics conference, so of course we're going to use analytics. So what we noticed was we had a lot of really great data that was coming in as part of an online transaction. So when a customer accesses a website and they post a transaction, they have things like their IP address, there's some browser information, some operating system information that tends to be passed along. Buyers and sellers are also providing contact information when they register their accounts. The sellers are providing some information around venues, the acts, things like that, and the buyer's providing payment details. And that's really useful. So here's a really good example of taking some of that data together and looking for potentially fraudulent transactions. So velocity like how quick, right? Velocity, where's a buyer accessing from? So you're looking at, there's a machine on the internet that has an IP address associated with it. That IP address is registered in some part of the country. There's a location. How far is that from the billing address? How far from where the venue, the location of the event? And what's the time to that event? So let's take the case here. And I want a show of hands. If you think this is a good order, put your hand up when I finish. So the event is in Dallas, 2 hours from now. The buyer, they're accessing from New York. The credit card's registered in San Francisco. Who thinks that's a good order? Okay, all right. I don't know, right? It could be, right? It could be the administrative assistants in New York placing the order. They could be in Dallas right now. They may be shipping them electronic tickets by email. Who knows? So what we found was things that potentially looked suspicious weren't necessarily indicative of fraud. So what we did is we pulled about 18 months of data together. This is where we get into the analytics, right? It was like, oh, come on. We locked our statisticians in a room, fed them lots of coffee. We occasionally slid a donut underneath the door, and we gave them lots of data. And we asked them to look for patterns in the data. Look for something, anything that would indicate or would allow us to identify potentially fraudulent transactions as they're being presented. They ended up using logistics regression for that to produce the models. Anybody familiar with this? Wow. Okay, does anybody see the error? Oh, okay, there's part of it's missing. So anyway, next. What they came out with were a number of models. The first initial models were rather rudimentary and they didn't catch a lot. But basically what they did is that every time they came up with the model, they'd run it through a subset of data. The same subset that each revision of the model would go through. And they were looking for false positives, false negatives, and their catch rate. And so a false positive is, like you see over here, a transaction that a model predicted to be fraud, but really was a legitimate transaction. And we knew what the outcome of these transactions were because it was old data that we had already resolved all of the orders within. And so we looked for the matchups, and we evaluated the number of false positives, the number of false negatives, and the correct responses. And when we started seeing a good mix, we then took that model along with the rest of them, and we started comparing them. And so what we were looking for is and I wish I had a laser pointer. You'll just have to go with me. What we were looking for was the most amount of fraud caught in the least number of orders being reviewed, right? So the x-axis is the number of orders being reviewed as a percentage of total volume. The y-axis is being the percentage of the actual fraud transactions that were being caught. And what we found was if you reviewed a whole hell of a lot of orders, you could catch a whole lot of fraud. But there's diminishing returns. At some point, you can't seat enough people in a room that can review all those orders in a timely fashion to not create a bad customer experience. There's lots of costs that are associated with that. So once we found a model, once we picked one that was really well performing, we ran it through a very large data set, entire transaction volume for a number of months. And what that did is we were able to produce a report of where each of the orders would have fallen in a score range, a numeric score range. The output of our model is a numeric score. And how predictive that was of an individual transaction being fraud or not. And what we found was, based on our first cut of the model, we could actually predict about 30 or 40% of our fraud without having to review too many of the orders right out of the gate. And so what we did is we took that model and we immediately put it into production as quickly as we could. And so the very next month, when that model went into production, we saw a drop-off in transactional volume. And we saw that continue throughout the year. So we were able to take that analytical method. I hate being right before drinks, right? You want to rush through and get them. We took that analytical method and we were able to reduce the number of dollars that were flowing out the back door pretty dramatically. And we were able to, this is the 2011 numbers, we were able to, oh, I'm sorry, back up one. We're able to keep those numbers down even through another full calendar year. And so it was highly successful for us in managing fraud. Now you can go to the next one. So what were the results? So the results are, first year we were able to reduce our losses around transactional fraud by about 33%. The false positives, the number of good customers that were misidentified and interrupted in their transactions were less than 10% of our decisions, which if anybody has a retail background here, that's actually a really good number for the level of decisions we were making. Really interestingly, because of the marketplace that we run and the fact that we were looking at all these transactions, we were able to actually get those customers back on the site and transacted about 95% of the time. So very little impact to the actual customer experience other than a small hiccup. And that accuracy actually allowed us to keep the headcount really low managing this volume. So our marketplace, we were able to manage it with under 20 people, which is a pretty interesting feat. And what's really cool is that we thought, oh man, what's it going to take to pay this back? We spent a lot of money putting all this in and hiring people and operating this. In 7 months, we broke even on it just by using this analytical method. And 18 months later, we've returned 5x on that. And so it's been a very fun ride. So that is the presentation.